Fitzgerald. Chapter 1. Paul and Betty Harris were teenage sweethearts. The courtship lasted 5 years until they married on the 2nd of May 1973. They had one child. His name was Tim. He was a son with an active imagination, his childish ideas that blossomed at midnight. Now, their living quarters were a cramped bedsit north of nowhere. They each held 9-to-5 jobs, and yet, they saved little money. Life wasn't turning out as they had hoped. The days were long and their nights were longer. Tim, their 6-year-old, wouldn't sleep. Like passing ships in the night, they often ended up in the same place, the frozen kitchen. Every time they met there, they carried the same expression, which said, "No one told me it would be like this." "I thought it was your turn." "Try get Tim asleep?" asked Betty. "Funny, I was thinking the same thing." "What's that?" "It was your turn?" "No, it was yours." "Oh, I see, that's the way ye like to play it. You carry him, bring him into the world screaming. You raise him, work, and keep the house." "House? Where's that?" Paul snapped, pulling the tablecloth up pretending to search for one. "Ha, ha, funny, always the clown just like your old fella." "My old fella?" "Ha, what about your old one?" "Crack a jaw." "My mother." "How dare ye?" "What about your old one?" "Snappy nappy." "And your old fella?" "Swallow the flagon." He didn't need swimming lessons to learn how to dive into the bottle. "Oh yeah, forgot. Your old fella's a priest, and your old one is a nun." "Sure yous are the holiest, most shocking family ever to walk the streets of Dublin." Betty dropped her head and cried, while Tim screamed for a drink. Despair came into the home. It was on the walls, the floors, and the old torn chairs. Paul picked up a cup and went to the sink. His tight grip broke the handle. The cup crashed off the ground, beside the overflowing bin. He hated that bedsit, the job, the long hours, the high taxes and the low pay. He craved a better life for his family. However, every effort he made amounted to the same thing, doom and gloom, and a never-ending circle of hopelessness. It had been a hard year and an even more challenging winter. In his youth, he had been the fellow with the jokes, the toast of the ball, Mr. Laugh-A-Minute guy. He now spends his time covering his irritations. Betty was small, of thin build, while Paul was tall and robust. She liked coffee, he liked tea, he liked football, and she liked bingo. He spent his time hiding things. She let everything out. She cried. She cried over her job, her husband's job, the kitchen, the floors, the cracked plaster, the leaky taps, and the walls, the paint, freckled brown, with hard blood spit on the bottom. Tim asked if Santa could bring him a brother. Betty never had a minute, nor the tiniest moment to think a friendly thought, or dream a big dream. She loved cooking. She cherished the hours, when her work was finished, and the door of her house closed. She'd sit at the fire. The heat raged like a dragon from a children's story. Up the small bag of spuds would go, finding a resting place on the countertop. She'd wash them, peel them, chop them and boil them, frying the eggs while the peas come to the boil. "Mommy, Mommy, get me this. I want a drink. Get me that. I want my dinner. Get it now." Then came the constant demands from Scream the House Down. "Tim." Paul found another cup and gave Tim a drink. He went to bed. Betty followed an hour later. They spent the night pulling and tugging at the blankets and hitting pillows that were once white but were now the color of the stained ceiling. The night was endless. And so they awoke to another morning, greeting each other with a grunt. Then they got ready for work. Betty dropped Tim off at her mother's house before racing to her job. While there, she poured out her heart to her friend, Mary. Mary listened and replied, "Our love, we are all in the same boat. As for Tim, read him stories at night that will get him off to sleep." "Are ye sure, Mary? Will tha do it?" "As sure as the good Lord is in heaven, and my fella is a drunken fool at will." "You'll see, yez will be as right as rain." After a wonderful night's sleep, Betty did as Mary said, and right enough, Tim hit the pillow like a laboring man. From that moment on he began to sleep the night through. But as Tim slept, another bombshell was about to hit. Paul's aging uncle came to stay. The man was a homeless drunk. There were nights he'd sleep between them. This often left Betty lying on the couch, where she'd bite the blanket, her fist, and the cushion on the chair. Anything not to scream. She'd stare at the ceiling, the door, and the picture on the wall. Her mother's words would come to her like long-lost relatives she'd rather run from. "Betty love, if that Paul gets ye in the family way, ye will wished God ye never met him. Mark me words, Betty. The wall he'll drive ye up won't be a fancy one. It will be full of rot, and smelly paper, put there when Jim Larkin was a boy. Mark me words, Betty. Mark me words. The paper on the walls wasn't the only thing that smelled. So did the chair. It was green, itchy and alive with uninvited guests. Little hoppers bite at night and crawl over your skin. The chair and Betty had fallen out the second it moved into the downtrodden bedsit. The chair was like a castaway from an old bus, or one of those seats she sat on a train. Yes, like everything in that place, she hated that chair. Paul found employment in construction. He disliked working for other men. Paul dreamed of having his own company. So one day, he walked off the job. He had enough of all the tall orders and small tasks. Without informing his wife, he went about advertising himself as a building contractor. Chapter 2. Mr. Ernest Dawn crossed his sitting room and opened the kitchen door. He peered in and let out a heavy sigh. The worn-out space had wires hanging everywhere and a large visible stain on the ceiling. A few days before he tried squeezing between the cooker and table and almost tripped. It was time he got something done. Mr. Dawn knew that age and neglect had made the cramped area dangerous, and so he uttered, "I'm in a pickle." Then lo and behold, a flyer entered his letterbox advertising Paul's business. Straight away, Mr. Dawn sat and drafted a letter, sending it to the address on the leaflet. According to what Paul read in the letter and the work that Mr. Ernest Dawn described, he thought, this is a big job, well, the biggest I've ever taken on. He regarded it as a significant stepping stone. So he drafted a letter of thanks and sent it to Mr. Ernest Dawn. Then, in a corresponding letter, they agreed to meet the following week. When Paul arrived at the house, he noticed that the glass in the door needed replacing. He looked through it and saw no one, except a long hall, a strange silence and a coat of mail. The coat of mail was in the corner. How can you see a strange silence? He knocked once, twice, and then a third time. But he received no answer. Paul stepped back, glanced at the windows, and pulled the paper from his pocket. The address was the one Mr. Dawn gave him. He was about to stroll away when he heard a noise coming from the rear of the building. A light came on, and an elderly man appeared. He sauntered along the hall. Though aged, he had bright eyes and a kind smile. Paul recognized a childlike expression. The gray-haired gentleman was heavy-set. His cheeks were full like ripened apples. He was dressed in checked trousers, a tartan shirt, and black braces. With an open hand, Mr. Dawn welcomed his guest. Over a cup of tea, the men chatted and in time, they became friends. 4 weeks later, the project began. At the first appearance of light, Mr. Dawn would emerge from the sitting room and direct his steps to the rear of the house. He'd sip his tea and inspect the work. A popular song from his youth would invade his mind, so he'd whistle along with the melody while savoring his drink. It was not until lunchtime that Mr. Dawn ventured towards the extension, to bring the lads a pot of tea. "The job is taking place," said Mr. Dawn. "It is, and weather permitting." He stopped, looked around and said, "We will finish it on time." "Excellent." "Why about all those bushes by the wall? Do you want us to clear them?" "No, number. They must block the light." "Follow me." Mr. Dawn wandered to where the thicket expanded. He dragged them apart, the way a fellow separates curtains. Then he nodded and Paul bowed his head and stepped beyond the opening. In front was an enormous garden with broad-spread apple trees and a wide array of plants. The sunset sky smiled on the garden so that the grass glistened. The beauty of the garden left Paul speechless. "This is perfect." "Yes, Mr. Dawn, but why hide it?" "Yes, I don't. There are so many wonderful things in life, but few find them. I wonder if I ever will." "You can't find what you're not looking for." "What a strange thing today," Paul thought, his thoughts interrupted by the loud voice behind him. "Paul, Paul," hollered the voice. "I better get going." Afterwards, Mr. Dawn headed into town. He loved the arts, and he was often found roaming around the small galleries in the city. Later, he would order a coffee and sit outside the shop across from the river Liffey, watching the passers-by rush into their day. On one of those outings, as he sat drinking his coffee, he sighed. He had gotten dreadful news from the bank. The news was not to his liking, nor would it be to Paul's. He was sure of that. Now, as the work came to a close, Mr. Dawn came clean and told Paul he had run out of money. Paul was in shock. Everything he had saved during the first 10 weeks went on the wages. Halfway through the job, he realized he'd underpriced the work. Then there was the problem with the manholes. To fix it, they had to dig down 15 feet, which added an extra 10%, so it left him broke. He had not got the heart to tell Betty, and he never blamed Mr. Dawn. "I'm very sorry, me son, I counted an extra zero on my money. The banker told me that when it was gone. I tried to withdraw more, but there was nothing left. I have another account, I'm sure, but I can't find it. For the life of me, I don't know where I put it." Paul felt sorry for him. He knew he was a good person, and he must have made a terrible mistake, as he could see by the embarrassed look on his face. "Don't worry, I have a lot of work on, and I'll make up the difference on the next job," he lied. He was devastated, so he took himself off to a lonely part of the garden and cried when he thought no one was looking. However, as he did, the old man heard him. 6 weeks later, as things went from bad to worse, a man intruded upon Betty. He handed her an envelope and told her to give it to her husband. She insisted that he tell her why. Then she asked the man to identify himself. He smiled, took her palm, handed her the envelope and strolled off. The encounter unsettled her. She wanted to throw it away, fearing it was a letter in matters of law. Paul had a few problems with jobs going wrong. This led to a lot of talk about court cases. Placing it on the mantelpiece, she left it there, throwing her broken necklace on top of it. The imitation diamonds spread across it like tiny castles on a board game. Days passed, long nights crawled in and no one took notice of the envelope. Chapter 3. The weeks passed, and the envelope remained hidden under a host of unpaid bills. However, one bright morning as Betty cleaned the house, the sunlight rushed through the window and lit upon the diamonds. They called for her attention. She stopped in her tracks and leaned on the top of the brush. Betty gripped the broom with her right hand while she reached out to her left. In a sweeping movement, she cast the other envelopes to the floor. The letters fell and scattered like fallen leaves. They made no sound as they hit the ground, but the jewels thrilled around, similar to candy floss in a machine. To her utter amazement, they shook until they settled on the intruder's letter. She grasped it and stood in silence, entertaining thoughts of suspicion and distrust. When she opened the envelope, she dropped it and held the contents high in the air. She was awestruck. Waves of emotions struck, and by no small measure, Betty was at first bewildered. She looked at it again and her eyes widened while a smile ran across her face, agreeable to the sudden surprise that gripped her. She took a step back and sat, allowing the distant sounds of the streets and the hum of the radio to come to life once again, for they had vanished from her hearing. Apprehension had led her captive, dragging her away into a terrible place, chaining her to her job. Now it changed. What the envelope contained was a check for £20,000. Her heart skipped a beat, then another. Her breath escaped her for a moment. Trembling, she lit a cigarette, inhaling a lungful. The smoke gushed from her mouth, increasing with each new drag. She stubbed it out and lit another, then another. Her heart was racing. 2 sharp drags, a wisp of smoke, 3 more puffs and a scream to heaven. Then she sank to her knees and lay down for what must have been an hour. When Paul arrived that evening, she burst upon him in a flood of excitement. The flood was so great that not even Noah would have escaped such a torrent. Paul, a few weeks ago I was standing in the street surrounded by people, and this man, a small man, he was old. He came up to me. He did. Paul looked at her through a yawn, with an expression that said, "Get on with it. You met a man, small, tall, and thin, bald, bent and old. Who cares? Forget that." "What's for dinner?" I admit, I did not like him at first. He was very talkative, like a parrot. "You know the ones in Barnes' pet shop?" "Ah, Betty, will ye give us a break? I had a long day and I'm starving." "What's for dinner?" Grasping him by the neck, she screamed, "Look, Paul, look what he gave me." "I mean you." The old man. "He gave you this?" On seeing the check, Paul broke into a cough. Reaching for the arm of the chair, he fell back, his eyes starlit, his heart racing. It was as if someone came and took a heavy load off him. They could not believe it, and the sleepless nights continued, but this time they were exciting. The open envelope lay on the locker right beside them like a smiling friend, who said, "Don't worry, I told you, everything will be all right." Chapter 4. The progression of this narrative demands that we go further with Paul and Betty Harris to uncover what they will discover. The check cleared, and they stood staring at one another. For how long they stood there is hard to tell. Then they visited Mr. Dawn. He never left his name. Paul knew it was he who left him the money. Needless to say, There was a lot of talk about money. The couple debated whether they should keep it or give it back. Maybe Mr. Dawn had lost his mind. Was it wrong? Was it right? The answer to those questions could only be answered by seeing the man in person. Now, the house was in a village in a Dublin suburb. It was a cottage that had a garden in front and back. In the front garden, there were sycamores. They were not alone because daffodils grew all around them. To the right of the cottage was a shed. The tin roof has rusted with age. Directly in front were iron gates. When Paul arrived, he breathed new life into the place via a hammer, a saw, and many skilled men. As they traveled there, he looked forward not only to seeing his friend but also to the cottage and how it had settled since the time he left. However, to his shock and horror, he found the cottage roofless, the windows boarded up, and every plant and tree dying like parched men in a desert. Paul was bewildered. The run-down house he'd refurbished had transformed into a dilapidated building. Ramshackle, he mouthed. No, ramshackle is not alone here. The cottage is weak, crumbling, and rickety. It is as if me and the men had never been here before. He called the neighbors, but they had no recollection of him or his men ever being there. As for the old man, well, he must have lived in another century because no one had dwelled in that house for at least 100 years, according to the neighbors. Paul stamped the ground like a child. He hit his fist on the wall. He exhausted every thought and called to mind the conversations he had with Mr. Dawn and the shouts from the men as they labored on the house. Time lapsed. Betty mouthed something from the car window. Taking a cigarette from a pack he had in his coat, he lit it and paced around the garden. He motioned with his hand for Betty to roll down the window. His suspicions affected his wife. "Wah, nothing," Paul shouted as he marched from the terrace wall to the path where the car was parked. He recalled again the sounds of the mixer, the men, the voices, the loud shouts of the men as he remembered, the plasterers, bricklayers, the roofers, the banter, and every penny he paid them. Rushing back to the car like an armed robber, he jumped in and tried turning the key. His hand was shaking. "What's going on?" "I have not got a clue, Betty." "Are ye sure?" "Betty, here, a man is standing at his door." "Go and ask him." "Ask him where?" "I asked the neighbors already." Staring at his wife, he slowed his speech down and dropped his tone. "Betty, they never met me or the lads." As for Mr. Dawn, he came out of a comic book. "A comic book? Cause someone is either playing a joke on me or I'm after being working with Doctor Who." "Doctor Who?" We explored the universe in a time-traveling spaceship called the TARDIS. Mr. Dawn is the man from the moon and I've been working with Willy Wonka in the chocolate factory. Come on, let's get out of here." The next morning, to their amazement, they found the money was still there. That part was real. As for the rest, they did not understand what was going on. "Paul, you must have gotten the address wrong. So, let's get this right here. What you're saying is that I can't remember the address of a house I worked on for 3 months. Are you for real?" Why else could it be? He could not have up and vanished. "And I have the answer to that." "No, I don't." "Maybe it was some other man that gave me the money." "Oh yes, why did I not think of that? Some fictitious character came out of nowhere and gave you the money, while my friend Mr. Dawn, who is not real by the way, just evaporated into thin air." Chapter 5. When the darkness came and their heads hit the pillow, they dreamt a dream. Now, it was the same dream. Yes, they dreamt the same dream. Their heads lay on different pillows. One head looked right, the other looked left. And yet they dreamt the same dream. They dreamt about a boy, a book and a gardener called Mr. Whitehead. The boy's name was Jack, whom the people named a vagabond. Now, the couple awoke at the same time. How did they know they awoke at the same time? Because they sprang up when the clock sang, "It is 8 o'clock on the button." A time to rise, and a time to shine. Startled, they dive out of the bed and gathering their clothes, they dashed down the stairs in a frenzy. They didn't get to say a word because they found themselves back in bed with the singing clock blasting in their ear, the identical tune. For them, time stood still. The clock stopped singing. Betty and Paul fell asleep, and when they awoke it was a brand new day. An envelope came through the letterbox. A law firm sent it, addressing it to Paul. He opened it. The signature on the bottom read, "Melchizedek, the advocate." The letter contained the receipt of ownership of the cottage Paul had worked on. There were 5 pages on the money he'd received. What he found strange in the middle of a lot of unusual things was, on every page the writing became smaller, until the writer reduced the letters to dots. He could make out a list of instructions, which informed him he'd have 10 days to buy a property at an address listed with the money. Paul was to reconstruct the building because it needed repair. If he failed to follow the plans, Melchizedek would freeze the money. Paul did not know how he could freeze money in his account. After seeing what he saw, he refused to debate the question. The following evening they visited the address only to discover the shell of a once beautiful home that had no roof, no windows, and no doors. The bolted gates opened by themselves and in Paul and his wife strolled. Now, close to the mansion was a narrow path, with a sign that declared, "The broad way many find but the narrow one few obtain." The couple looked at one another. Betty gripped her husband's hand. Outside the house was a tottering table with a scroll and a candlestick holding 12 candles. The seconds turned into hours but the hours turned into seconds, for although the couple had spent some time there, it was as if they had just arrived. Betty concluded it was her job to open the scroll. She inched towards the table, and as she was about to lift the scroll, a person appeared at the door. He was a man with artistic eyes. Betty did not know what artistic eyes were, but they are the only words that came to mind. Paul and Betty froze. The man said, "Do not be afraid, and do not open that which is closed." Another person, handsome in appearance, stepped out of nowhere. Paul and Betty did not understand where nowhere was, but they knew that handsome person had stepped out of it. There were words written across his forehead, which said, "I am a gift." He stood still. The man with the artistic eyes said, "This is time, see he stands still." A large car pulled up. The driver jumped out and opened the back door. A man stepped forward, dressed in black. He was ageless, of slender build, with locks of flowing white hair. He came towards the couple. They noticed there was something wonderful about his eyes. A strange fire inflamed them. He introduced himself as Mr. Melchizedek. Paul felt as if he had met him before. Together they walked around the old ruin and Mr. Melchizedek pointed out what he wanted Paul to do in finishing the job. The graphic expression of Mr. Melchizedek was profound and everything that transcribed was delightful. And so Paul and Betty Harris became the housekeepers of every request of Mr. Melchizedek. When they asked after Mr. Dawn, he simply replied, "Everything is as it should be." As for Mr. Dawn, he is doing just fine. So in the summer of 1974, they started the build. And by the end of that year, all the work was complete. To their utter surprise, everything came in on budget, right down to the last nail. They spent the $20,000. Paul bought the house, renovated it, refurbished it, tilled the ground and moved into the new family home. The only letter they got was written in a few words. "See, I am making everything new. It is finished. Signed Ernest Dawn." They gazed at the name and as they did, the names brought meaning. Ernest, showing sincere and intense conviction. Dawn, the first appearance of light. Suddenly it was like a bolt of lightning hit them and they knew that Mr. Ernest Dawn and Mr. Melchizedek were one and the same. From then on, Paul's company took off. He had to go and live in England for a while because he got a big job there. With Paul away and Tim at school, Betty found herself with time on her hands. So with time on her hands, she went about using them, tending the enormous back garden. She had fallen into this habit and favored the mornings where she would put her hands to good working, knowing time was in them. Betty knew that idle pursuit was the activity to build castles in the sand, to pace around in a never-ending restless place watching life's memories of what should have been or could have been. The prison of regret trying to fix lost time, when along with each morning came a brand new day awoke by mercy. For even mercy renewed himself every morning, for Betty had read, "My mercies are new every morning." One winter's afternoon, as she was sweeping the garden, fallen leaves blew into the house. So Betty went about gathering them. And it was while she did that Betty stumbled on something. She had been cleaning the cellar when she happened upon a door in the ground, covered by a mat. Opening it up, she climbed down a ladder, picturing herself like a character from an adventure film. With the light in hand, she walked around in what could only be described as catacomb-type cells. There was Betty, the dark, the cells, and a book. Picking it up, she blew the thick dust off it. Then she rubbed her hand across the worn cover and read the title, "Anna Gardner, and the Boy." The pages were old, brown, and stained. The penned writing was barely legible, but she could make them out. Leaving the cellar, she entered the kitchen. It was there she decided to rewrite the story and send it to Paul. When it was complete, She sent it. And when Paul had a quiet night, he read the story. And this is the story he read, a story of a gardener, and the boy.